everything looks better in slow motion. Well, not everything. There's certain things you really don't want to film in slow motion, especially if they don't actually move that much. Like a tortoise walking along a field. That is already slow motion. I did actually say this phrase, everything looks better in slow motion, at a workshop a few years ago. And somebody put their hand up, and I thought they were joking, but they were deadly serious. And they said, so why do you film stuff at normal speed at all then? Why do you film like your interviews at normal speed? Why are you not doing slow motion for that? I just kind of was a bit dumbfounded. I scratched my head. There are times when slow motion is completely wrong.
And anything with dialogue is that.
There's lots of ways we use slow motion to lift our production value, to make things look great, but we can overuse it. I'm going to spend this episode going through the different ways you can shoot slow motion, the different frame rates from our lower slow motion frame rates of 50p through to our higher frame rates. We're also going to cover how to light for slow motion, which is really important so we get the best possible results. We have a lot to cover, so it's time to crack on. For this first example, I'm going to show you some simple B-roll shots of people going about the business. I'm going to try some different cameras. These are the tools I'm going to be using today. This camera here is a mirrorless camera, and it shoots 4K up to 60 frames per second, and it also does in HD up to 180 frames per second. I'm also going to use this one here, which only shoots 60 frames per second in HD. In 4K it's only up to 30, but it does shoot up to 120 frames per second in a cropped sensor. I'll explain more about that in a bit. This little one here shoots up to 1000 frames per second in an utterly unusable mode, but about 250 it's actually really good, but it only shoots for 4 seconds. This is buffered mode. We'll explain buffered again in a bit. I also have my mobile phone, and this also shoots about 240 frames per second. Not great quality, but for things like Instagram and social media, it's pretty good. I'm also going to steal back my camera, which Julian and Sarah are using to film me, because it shoots 4K in 60 frames per second, in 2K at up to 240 frames per second, and it also does 4K at 120 frames per second max, but only in a 4-second burst. That's a lot of numbers. Let's actually shoot something now. When do you use slow motion? When do you shoot it? Well, when I was shooting the Wonderlist for CNN, for the B-roll, I shot a lot of 4K 60. This is for the really beautiful exotic shots and the scenery of animals and things like that. Because you can always speed it up a little bit. There are some caveats depending on the camera that shoots in the 4K 60 frames. Because a lot of the cameras, when they do shoot that, they don't record sound. Where some cameras do record sound when you shoot in that frame rates. It's really important to make sure you get some natural sound, like the motorbikes or other things that actually paint a picture of where you are. We have people walking around. It's nice to get some natural sound. You don't want just some music. So do some slow motion and then record some real time to get some natural sound, or use a sound recorder to capture that other stuff. It's really important. How slow your camera can go is of course dependent on the camera. Some of them are incredibly good and some of them have no slow motion whatsoever. But it's also to do with the system frequency, as in NTSC and PAL, 60i, 50i. NTSC users tend to have a higher frame rate, better slow motion. That's why we call it higher frame rate, which is anything over 60 frames per second. So the camera we're filming me right now shoots in 4K up to 60p. But in PAL, it will only do it up to 50p. In HD, it will give me 200 frames per second in PAL and 240 in NTSC. So that is a bit of a downside. It's not always the case. This little one here actually is the other way round. And in PAL, it actually shoots in a higher frame rate. But actually, sometimes you don't need to go as high as the camera can shoot. This is a maximum. It doesn't always mean you should use it. What I'm getting right now is a quick cutaway of this group over there, because they were nattering really loudly during that last little bit's camera. So just making sure we see the sound. We talked about this in the interview episode, and this comes across in every aspect of our filming. So I'm talking, I can hear them, we can't see them, and now we have a shot which establishes them. So you often see slow motion referred to as P or FPS. Which one is which? Well, FPS traditionally refers to what we call an overcrank. So you'll see it written in the camera as, like on this one right now, as 180 FPS at 25p. So our base recording is at 25p, but it's recording 180 frames. So when it plays back, it will automatically be slow motion. As a rule though, tends to be no sound is recorded, it is mute. Now, if you're recording something which is called P, then it does tend to record sound at the same time, because that is not overcrank, it's simply recording at a higher frame rate. On this camera though, when it's shooting in 4K, it doesn't say FPS, it says P, as in 50p or 60p. What this means is it's recording all of those frames at that time base, at 50p or 60p. So you have to change that in post to turn it into slow motion. The advantage of this is it does record sound. The downside is you tend to weaken your bit rate, because when it's recorded at FPS at a base time rate of say 25, it still maintains its full bit rate for that codec. But when you record it at 50p or 60p and you have to change it to slow motion in post, you are stretching out that codec and weakens it. That's really the main downside of doing it that way, because it is really nice to record sound at the same time without having to get additional shots just for the audio. The rule that we established with shutter speed in the first episode needs to be stuck to. That is double your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 50p, 1/100th of a second. 180 frames per second here, shoot at 1/360th of a second. If your camera doesn't have a shutter speed that matches exactly double your frame rates, just get it as close as you can, but always make it above rather than below. If you're lucky enough to have a camera that shoots in shutter angle as well as shutter speed, it is actually a lot less faff. This camera over here doesn't have it. So if we're changing our frame rates from normal speed to slow motion, we're always having to make sure we change our shutter speed, and it's easy to forget to do that, and you end up with some nasty motion blur. If you set your shutter angle, like I can here, to 180 degrees, my shutter speed will always be effectively double my frame rate. Much nicer and much easier, and something else you can just forget about and concentrate on getting the shots. If you're out and about filming, not sure if you want to shoot a bit of slow motion or not, I would always suggest filming in slow motion, because if you don't film in slow motion, you get to the edit and you go, I wish that was slow motion. If you start doing it in post, it's never going to look as good. There are some pretty good plugins out there which do a fairly good job, but it's never going to look as good as doing it in camera. The only real downside to shooting in slow motion, if you don't need it, you're going to play it at real time and you get into the edit, is your shutter speed is going to be too high. So you could have not the right amount of motion blur, so it could be a little bit staccato. There are some plugins out there which will add a little bit of motion blur. That is the downside. What works best for slow motion? Well, things that are moving fast are always going to look good. When you're doing action sports, of course, that's going to look great for slow motion. But actually, people look great in slow motion. Faces look good in slow motion. You get these natural movements, you get the muscles, you get the smiles. That's actually my favourite thing to film. The things you don't always think about as being great for slow motion.
Now as the ladder of life has been strung, you might think a sweet song, the bottom is strong. Oh, I spent time in ashes and smoke. In this whole wide world, there's no happier